If we look at our project, you can see we have our layers blocked out in time when I want the different layers to appear. So we're actually all set to begin animation. Now we'll create animation by adding keyframes. And if you've been going through the previous videos, you already know how to add a keyframe. So in this video, not only are we going to add keyframes, but I'll show you how to quickly create animation by copying and pasting these keyframes, and some other methods to adding keyframes, like sliding the keyframes or animating backwards. To show you what I mean, let's go ahead and get started. So let's start by animating the fade of this blue background. If we scrub through, notice the background already has the blue and the circles in the scene. Let's start at 1 second. We're going to animate backwards. So I want you to select the circles and the blue treatment layer. So to select both layers, I'm going to hold down the Command key, or you can hold down the Control key on Windows and click on one and click on the other. That will allow you to skip layer 9. Now if you press T to open the opacity settings, notice those settings have transformed from the Photoshop document. So the circles were only at 45% opacity and the blue treatment was at 84%. So let's add keyframes for both of those. Now notice when I added the keyframe for the opacity, it automatically added the keyframe for layer 10 since that layer was already selected. Now let's grab our current time indicator and move it to the beginning of our composition and just click and drag to change the opacity value down to 0. Notice when I drag my top opacity down, it just dragged the opacity down the same proportion. So let's go ahead and drag the opacity for layer 10 down to 0 as well. Now if we scrub there, you can see my background and my circles are going to fade in. Now I want my circles to fade in a little later, so in order to quickly select both of those keyframes, I'll just click on the word opacity for layer 8. Now notice when I did that, it deselect layer 10. So actually what I'm going to do is click in this grey area and draw a lasso around these two keyframes. When I clicked in the grey area, it automatically deselected any other layer selected, and then I drew the lasso, so now both keyframes are selected, and I know that because they're gold. So let's go ahead and move those keyframes down the timeline. Let's move them down to about frame 20, and I know I'm on frame 20 because if you look in the info panel in the upper right corner, you can see it's frame 20. Now let's go to the navigation arrows here on the left side of the timeline. I want to click the right navigation arrow to jump down to the first keyframe. Now let's just trim the start point of that layer. Since it's 0 opacity anyway, I don't need the layer to exist any time before that keyframe. If you hold down Shift as you drag, it'll snap to the current time indicator. So we've successfully animated 2 layers relatively quickly. Now let's look at animating these plus layers. I'll start by just animating the large pluses, so let's open up the parameters for the transform options under layer 7. Let's start by adding a scale so it looks like they're actually growing towards the camera. I'm going to move to the endpoint of this layer by pressing I on my keyboard. Now go ahead and click the stopwatch next to scale to add the first keyframe. Go ahead and press O to move to the out point of that layer, and let's increase the scale to a value of about 133. Now if we scrub through, you can see that that layer is scaling up over time. Now I want to add a slight fade in and fade out to this layer as well. So let's press I to move back to the beginning of the layer. Since the opacity is set at 56%, what I'm going to do is just add a keyframe for the opacity and then click on that keyframe and drag it down the timeline. I'm just going to drag it down to about 1 second, 12 frames, and that's a 12 frame fade in. So now we can just decrease the opacity by clicking and dragging on that value. Now I'm going to draw a lasso around these 2 keyframes and copy them. Command C or Control C. Now let's move down the timeline to about 707. Now make sure layer 7 is selected, and then press Command V or Control V to paste those keyframes. Now with these 2 keyframes, let's go ahead and click on the rightmost keyframe and hold down Shift as we drag, and it'll snap to the end of that layer. Now the only problem is that the fact my first keyframe is 0 opacity. So if we scrub through, we can see my pluses fade in and then they start to actually fade out. So I need to reverse these 2 keyframes. You can reverse these keyframes in time by going up under the animation menu. Under there, you can see there's a keyframe assistant. Then we can choose time reverse keyframes. This will automatically flip those two keyframes around. So now if I click on my navigation arrow to the right to move to my next keyframe, you can see it's at 56%, and if we scrub down it fades out to 0. So let's copy these keyframes and paste them to all the other plus layers. I'll go ahead and just draw a lasso around all of the keyframes and Command C to copy, and let's press I to move to the start point of that layer. Now we can select layers 6 through 4 by clicking on one and Shift clicking on the top one. And that'll select all of them, and then press Command V to paste. Let's press the U key to make sure and they all pasted, and they did. The important thing to understand when you paste keyframes is that it will paste the leftmost keyframe, direct current time indicator, so that the rest of the keyframes slide down accordingly. So if you scrub through the timeline, you can see that the pluses are definitely scaling up towards the camera. Now let's animate the word training. One of the advantages of creating text inside of Photoshop is the fact that you can actually make it editable inside of After Effects. So select layer 3 and go up under the layer menu. In here I can convert this text to editable text. Now when I do that, notice the style that was applied to the text has disappeared. That's okay in this instance. So let's just go ahead and leave the text as editable. Since the text is now editable inside of After Effects, I could just double click directly on the text and then change the text to say whatever I want. I'm just going to press escape because I don't want to change the word training. Now I want the word training and the plus symbol to move together in unison. So what I'm going to do is select layer 3 and press I to move its endpoint. I want there to be a quick fade on this text, so I'm going to press T to see the opacity settings. Let's move 12 frames down the timeline and then just add a keyframe for the opacity, and we can for the same thing for layer 2. So let's select layer 2, press T to open it, opacity, and add a keyframe. I'm going to press I to move to beginning or end point of the layer, and we can press 0 and press Tab to move between the fields. Notice when I press Tab it moves between any of the open fields down the layers in my layer hierarchy. So now you can see my text is fading in. Now in order to have the plus symbol follow what's happening with my training text, what I'm going to do is use this option called parenting. So I'm going to click on the parent pick width and point it at layer 3. Now I know that doesn't seem like anything has changed, but if you look here, it's saying the parent of layer 2 is layer 3. Now, if you don't have this parent column active, go to the right side of your timeline and click on the fly out button. In here, you can go to columns and make sure that parent is actually activated. Okay, so now all we have to do is select layer 3 and press S to open its scale. Now notice the scale of the text is already set at a very high scale, but the text doesn't look like it's soft. That's because the text is vector based. So even though it's way up over 100%, it's still perfectly sharp. So what we can do is just go ahead and add a keyframe here by pressing I to move to the end point of the layer. And then just click the stopwatch to add a scale keyframe. Now since we created text or made editable text, our text edit panels opened up here. So my paragraph panel has snuck in on my timeline. There's this little slider here on the timeline which adjusts the magnification. I'm going to go and click on the right side of the magnification here so I can see the entire duration of the timeline. Now if I press O, my current time indicator will move to the out point of the layer, and then I can just click and drag to increase the scale of the word training. And notice now my plus symbol is moving right along with it. So we have the word fade in with our plus symbol. So we have the majority of our animation blocked out, and we can definitely keep tweaking this animation. But I think we've already covered the basics of how to add keyframes to a working composition. Of course you can copy and paste keyframes in between layers. You want to pay attention to where your current time indicator is when you go to paste those keyframes, so you know exactly where in the timeline they're going to be pasted. And of course there are extra helpers you can use for your animations, like parenting, to have one layer follow the animation of another layer. Or if you want to reverse keyframes in the timeline, you can select those keyframes and go under the animation menu. Under the keyframe assistant, we could reverse those keyframes. So I know that was a lot, but since you got through it, you've covered a real workflow for adding keyframes into a working animation.